Hi there, and welcome to the Chautauqua Visual Arts Lecture Series. I'm so excited that you're here this evening, especially for this important presentation by Miguel Luciano. Miguel, who's not only a wonderful person, a generous artist to other artists, he is a multimedia visual artist whose work explores themes of history, popular culture, social justice, and migration through many different media, including sculpture, painting, and socially engaged public artworks. His work has been exhibited all over the world, including in Cuba, Brazil, Mexico, France, and here in the United States at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., where they have recently acquired his work. He is also a wonderful educator. I teach with him at the School of Visual Arts in New York City, and he also is a professor at Yale University School of Art in New Haven. Miguel is from Puerto Rico, but he resides in Harlem, and I believe he's going to talk about that. He's also currently a fellow at the Blade of Grass Fellow for Socially Engaged Art. And he's an artist in residence within the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Civic Practice Partnership, which he's also going to talk about here. I'm so excited and very grateful for Miguel coming here. I think this is going to be a really life-changing opportunity to hear a lot of different perspectives from him. And hopefully we'll be able to meet him in person next season at Chautauqua. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand this over to Miguel. Miguel, it's all yours. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you at the end for questions and more conversation. What's so great about Chautauquans is they're hungry and thirsty for things. And I think speaking truth right now is really important, more than ever, would you say? Yeah. So. Yes, go ahead, Miguel. Sorry.
No, I'm just agreeing. I'm just agreeing. Yeah.
So we have a big election coming up. Yes. And I know this recording we're going to be seeing after the election. And I'm hoping that, word is that we're good to go. But before
ask the question. Go ahead, ask the question.
I'll ask you this question. Mm-hmm. So as we start to frame this talk too, and also I'm dying to find out how you got to be an artist too. I have to ask that question later. But, you know, as we have this election coming up and you have positioned yourself at the Met purposely to do this, I'm just wondering too, if you'll talk about how artists can position themselves no matter who's in that office to be able to make that change. So you gave us some good examples, but I guess we're going to be seeing what you're going to be doing here or what you have done in order to make those changes. But I just wonder if every artist is looking for a silver bullet. There is none, but there must be some ways in which we can have more activists as artists as activists in the world to make change.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think that regardless of which way things go during elections, I mean, the work is cut out for us. And, you know, obviously, I hope that the world's less chaotic and that Biden wins so that there's an easier path. But I don't think it's that much easier because, like, the stuff that I want to talk about is bigger than this election, you know, and bigger than who wins. You know, it's like we continue to live in a racist society, in a country and in a world that has inherited racist colonial legacies of white supremacy, and that's true regardless of who wins, right? The difference, perhaps, is that we can get more cooperation in trying to create change. You know, if people vote that way, and so it's like, you know, racism is on the ballot.
That's exactly right. Racism is on the ballot. No question about it.
And this is like weird to say at the top of the talk, but it is on the ballot, and
it is.
And it's like, you know, if racism is not a deal breaker, right? in someone's choice, then this is part of the problem in our country.
Racism is on the ballot. I got to put that all over me. Well, with that, I am welcoming you back. And we're ready to go finally. And I just want to thank you. That was a really amazing. I mean, I learned so much from you. This is going to be great. So thank you, Miguel. And Chip, want to start the process? Here we go. All righty. Miguel, it's all yours. I'm out of here, and okay. I'll see you on the other side.
Okay, we're all good. Yeah? Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for those that have stayed on. And I hope that some of what we talked about will make sense in this lecture. But thanks again, Sharon, for having me, and to Chautauqua for hosting this series. I'm going to show some images from my work and research right now, and I thought at the top here that I would talk about a current project that felt especially relevant on the day after Indigenous Peoples Day, which is yesterday, that instead of celebrating Columbus, we can celebrate Indigenous people and the history of Indigenous peoples in this country. And that, I think, is a way of decolonizing the holiday itself. And it felt especially sort of like related to this image that I'm showing on screen, which is an image of a Taino artwork from about 1,000 years ago. And it was a wooden sculpture called Taino Semi Cohoba Stand. And this was, let me see here. I'm sorry, I'm gonna enlarge my screen so I can see this here. Perfect. Okay, and so this is an object that's currently on view in this exhibition, Arte del Mar, Artistic Exchange in the Caribbean. That's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where, as I mentioned, I'm currently working as an artist in residence in the Civic Practice Partnership Artist Residency Program. So this is a significant artwork in the history of Taino sculpture, and probably one of the most important wooden sculptures from this era that exist. So the Tainos were the first peoples of the Caribbean, and they were a broad culture and society throughout the Caribbean that migrated from sort of the top of South America into Central America and into the Antilles. And this object was originally used as a kind of ceremonial object to break curses, to create protection for communities. And the Semi name, which is assigned to this object and to many objects, Semi is the word for a kind of deity that is imagined or envisioned in the material itself, be it wood or stone. And so here, the Semi figure is, if you look closely, is crying. Its eyes are sort of weeping. There are these kind of grooves underneath it, and his teeth are gritting, and his face is grimacing. His ears are wide open, and this on the top of his head is sort of a pedestal that would be used to ground cohoba, which was this hallucinogenic sort of powder derived from a plant, and was used for these vision quests by the community leaders, by the caciques or the shamans in the community. And so I have been privileged to work with this object. It's been a touchstone at the museum for many, many years, not just for me, but for many people from the Caribbean. It's originally from the Dominican Republic or Haiti, probably, we think, but it could be from anywhere in the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico. And so I had the opportunity to get close to this object behind the scenes and study it. And we did a scan of the object through all this great technology in the imaging department, a 3D scan. And my goal was to sort of create a replica, right, of this object. So these images here are these are really kind of like new in progress images of the first replicas ever to be made from this Taino Semi sculpture. And the image on the left was milled from that 3D scan into a new material, all kind of like through a computer and robotics. The image on the right was cast in fiberglass after we made a mold, and these haven't been painted or finished. This is kind of all in process. Here again, sort of like doing some of the cleanup work on a fiberglass casting. And a few more here. There's a resin cast and sort of a plaster mold as well. Another close-up of the resin here in blue, and I've been thinking about the color blue in relation to the sea and the sky. But a part of the reason that I wanted to actually create a casting is so that the object could be symbolically removed from the vitrine, be removed from the institution, and reintroduced to a community context. And that action for me was a way of decolonizing the museum as a context for this work, right? And a way of reclaiming the object and returning it to the people who share directly in its own history and heritage. And so that for me is also kind of an activist project or a political action that I think about with this opportunity. How do we actually come to understand this in a personal space, in a community space, in a cultural space that is outside of the conditions of the Metropolitan Museum, this glass vitrine, and the history of extraction that is associated with this object and the way that we see it. In other words, you know, the way that it ends up in the Met's collection even is because it was taken from where it originally lived. So another aspect of this that's interesting is that when we started doing the 3D scan and we created this imagery, this kind of file for it, the Met went on to also then create this augmented reality program with that technology. And so what you're looking at is sort of like an excerpt from an online sort of, the Met's website shows you kind of how that was done. And what you can do now on your phone, if you go to their website or you Google augmented reality Taínos and me, is that you can see this object through your phone in any space that you're in. And this is interesting to me because it was another way of doing what I was symbolically doing with making this replica, this casting, is that you can see this object removed from the museum in your personal space, in any space outside of the museum. So this is kind of an interesting development, that the first object that the Met would create an augmented reality sort of like program for would be a Taíno work or a Taíno artwork and artifact, is significant because the Taínos were the first people to be colonized by Europeans in the so-called New World. And so it felt fitting that if we're talking about decolonizing and ways of doing that, that we would actually address this specific history directly. So this is a cover of the catalog from the 1973 exhibition, The Art Heritage of Puerto Rico. And I was speaking about this at the top of the program before we started recording. But this exhibition in 1973 that was a joint venture between El Museo del Barrio and the Metropolitan Museum of Art was the first time Puerto Rican artwork was ever shown at the Met. And that was huge. And if you notice on the catalog cover, you see it in both English and in Spanish. First time in the Met's history that they did labels and a publication in both English and Spanish. And how does that happen? That happens because El Museo del Barrio and the people who were running the museum at the time, Marta Morena Vega, Iram Marestani was one of the people working as the photographer at that time, and others insisted upon it. And it was very education driven. It was an initiative that was driven by this community museum in East Harlem in collaboration with the grandest museum in the country down the street, practically in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So huge history. This has been, a lot of my research has been about this history. And so in working with this new Taíno, not this new Taíno object, but the Taíno object currently on view, it's a way of also connecting to a longer history. And I'm trying to draw this out in this residency and sort of make visible where we've been represented in the past, but also call attention to the fact that this was almost 50 years ago, this exhibition, and there hasn't been a significant exhibition about, or that's included Puerto Rican art really since then. Not in this way. This was the largest survey of Puerto Rican art in the country, and to this day it still remains in any American museum. I want to introduce here, and if you're able to see this on screen, I'm going to enlarge my screen personally so I can see this up close. But I want to show this image because when I started to work with the Met, and when I was first invited to do a talk there, before this residency even, I was invited to do an artist on artworks talk. And one of the images on view was this image. And it stood out to me. It was in the Drawings and Prints collection. And it was a print that was done in the late 1500s about the discovery of America, okay? And this was in 2016, and right around this time of year, it was like during the height of Donald Trump's first rise and the propaganda of making America great again. And so I wanted to look then at what are the images of America that are in the Met's collection. What are the earliest images of America that were published and on view and made visible to the greater world? And this is a good place to start because this is the late 1500s, and it's an image of Amerigo Vespucci discovering, I'm putting that in quotes, like America, right? This is the beginning of colonization. As Vespucci, after who America is named, by the way, Amerigo Vespucci is where we get the name America, is standing here fully clothed right before a nude native woman on a hammock who sort of beckons towards him as he plants the flag and the cross. And what this becomes, and it's similar to many, many images that will follow in this history, is a classic illustration of white supremacy and the way that these images are reproduced and cemented in the European imagination and in the American imagination later in this history of discovery, which is really a history of colonization, right? Because people were here already. Societies had been here for many, many, many years before Europeans arrived. Huge, successful, accomplished societies. So, if you look, it's hard to see it in this image, but in the background, there are native peoples that are roasting human parts over a fire. And this is the Met's description. I'll just read their description of this image. This is by Jan van der Strut originally, the original print. It says, it's an illustration of the sailor Vespucci coming ashore and discovering America. He encounters a native woman seated in a hammock. In the background, different figures are seated on the ground. A woman roasts a human leg on a wood-burning fire. In the middle ground, on the right, a horse and a bear approach one another. In the foreground on the right, an anteater searches for food. On the left, a ship rocks in the ocean and another is pushed up against the shore. And so this kind of land of fantastical beasts and cannibals and people depicted as savages, these are the very first images informing the European imagination about native peoples in the world. Incredibly racist, incredibly contrived sort of fantasies of European colonists. But it elevates the status of the Europeans and their whiteness to superior beings, and I would argue even to sort of godly beings at a certain point. So next to that print, this is back again in the same exhibition that I visited in 2016. I'm looking at these prints, and I did a talk about this, by the way. Everything I'm saying to you, I did a talk publicly in kind of deconstructing and decolonizing American art history at the Met. And so then you had the Apotheosis of Washington, and this image here is upon Washington's death, literally depicts him as a godlike figure kind of ascending to the heavens. And this is by John James Barrelett. Was done in 1800, 1802. Barrett's popular image, this is the Met's language again. Barrett's popular image includes a depiction of the president based on work by Gilbert Stewart, who is the famed portraitist that I'll talk about in a minute. Washington's rise from his tomb on a heavenly ray of light is helped with figures representing genius and immortality, while faith, hope, and charity look on. America is personified both as Lady Liberty, seated atop armor and holding a staff on whose tips rests a liberty cap, etc. And a Native American man with braided hair and headdress, a quiver and a tomahawk. Hunched over in mourning and guarding Washington's sarcophagus, they resemble images of sleeping soldiers at Christ's tomb. So I read this text because it's important that the elevation of figures like Washington to the status of godliness or a Christ-like figure are not accidental. These are images that have been literally inscribed and engraved in our visual imaginations and in our visual histories for centuries. So, again, sort of introducing some of those problematics and how white supremacy has been illustrated for centuries. These were just a few examples, another close-up here of that print. And then, of course, we have the famous image of Washington crossing the Delaware, which is one of the crown jewels of the institution. And eventually, in this talk, we made our way to the American wing, and we looked at this painting and looked at the way in which Washington crossing the Delaware, that's the famous painting by Emanuel Leutze, has become sort of larger, literally larger than life. And so this painting is like the size of a movie screen, if you ever get to see it in person. And it's impressive. The gilded frame around the painting is maybe even more impressive than the painting itself. It's extraordinary. But this was about sort of art and entertainment. This is painted maybe 100 years after Washington's death as a way to promote this history in a movie-like form. And at certain points, these kinds of paintings were even veiled with curtains, and people had to pay a fee to see them. So it was a kind of propaganda in this storytelling that was about sort of myth-making, right? Again, in this case, telling the stories of Washington as the first president and one of the so-called founding fathers of this country. And so, in the adjacent gallery, you've got a painting by Gilbert Stewart, one of the most famous portraits of Washington. This is the image that is on the dollar bill, or that the portrait on the dollar bill is sort of based upon, I would say. And one of the most famous kinds of images by Gilbert Stewart. So, at this point, I often ask what people think about Washington, or what they think of when they hear Washington's name or George Washington's story, right? What first things that come to mind. And people will say, well, the first president, right? The dollar bill, couldn't tell a lie. And sometimes in a group, people will say he was a slaveholder. And so then we try to open up that narrative a little more, because that's not the sort of narrative that leads. But then they'll say wooden teeth. That's another one, the wooden teeth sort of myth. And so there is a good opportunity to sort of talk about the history of Washington that's not talked about. He didn't have wooden teeth, actually. He had several pairs of dentures and false teeth that were made. None of them were made from wood. He had like dental problems, gum problems throughout his life. That's why you never see him smiling in any portraits that are painted of him. But here we have an image of one of the few remaining pairs of dentures that had a full set of teeth left in it. And this is in the museum at Mount Vernon, which is where his estate was. And sort of it's like the museum of Washington's estate. It includes this object. But these were not wooden teeth at all. These are human teeth mixed with animal teeth. And the human teeth that are in his dentures, that were in his own mouth, were extracted from the enslaved people that he owned. And that is also who the first president of the United States was. He owned over 300 people as slaves. Along with his wife, they had a huge enterprise on their plantation in Mount Vernon. And he put those teeth in his mouth, right? I mean, it's disgusting. It's a grotesque image, and it's a grotesque history. And it's not the object that they're going to show on view next to Washington crossing the Delaware, right? At least not until now. And it hasn't happened yet, but I'm just suggesting that possibility as an alternative narrative of how we might also tell the story of how cruel and grotesque these same figures were in terms of how they dehumanized other human beings and abused other human beings and upheld the legacies of slavery as slaveholders. So this problematic and very ugly part of their history is also part of the truth. And also, I think our responsibility as educators, as artists, as people who work with institutions, to tell the truth about these histories that are otherwise often whitewashed and sanitized. I showed all these images on iPads next to these paintings and so forth, and was sort of trying to interrogate these histories of Washington. And honestly, I never thought I'd be invited back to the museum to do another talk or another program. We had 40, 50 people in this group. But the museum actually encouraged it. The people from education encouraged it. It was a welcome debate, a welcome critique. And I found that incredibly refreshing. And that was sort of my first sort of entree into the museum as an experience with educators and public programs interrogating these histories at the Met. So again, a picture of the overall painting. And I want to point out here, like on the frame of the painting, this I think it reminds me so much of the world we live in now. In this amazingly sort of carved wooden and gilded golden frame is a scroll that says, "First in war, first in peace, first in the heart of his countrymen." And that was how Washington was being described. First in war, first in peace, first in the heart of his countrymen. And if that is not Trumpian, like, I don't know what is. It's a lot of firsts. And I also don't know how you can be first in war and first in peace, but he's first in everything. And it sounds so much like the current president, also with this kind of gaudy gilded gold. But I point that out because this is not a new phenomenon either, to sort of like, these embellishments and these kinds of fabrications of these histories have a long history. Next to these two paintings, also worth pointing out, are two also like movie-sized screen paintings. This one by Edwin Church, it was painted in the Andes. This is Ecuador, but these incredibly lush sort of romantic landscapes painted also in the late 1800s. Across from that one, these kind of flank the Washington crossing the Delaware. On the other side is a Bierstadt painting, also from late 1800s, about the Rocky Mountains and Lander's Point, I think this is referring to. And these are these kind of like romantic paintings that were really kind of travel brochures for Manifest Destiny. They literally functioned that way and sort of romanticized this landscape that was destined to be colonized by white settlers. And they believed in that right and entitlement, and so the Shoshone people that are depicted here in the foreground were depicted as a people that would eventually be eliminated and wiped out. And that inevitability was always suggested sort of in this forecasting. So that narrative also is present in the way these paintings are presented, as grand as they are in these galleries. And then you have this vase in the center called Indian vase. And so this is one of the few vases that's explicitly about Native Americans. It's by Ames Van Wart. It was made in 1876, so it's made at the centennial of the American history. And it's here that the museum does something interesting last year. It opened a huge exhibition called Native America, the Art of Native America, in the American wing downstairs. And that's an incredible exhibition of Native American artwork that's currently on view at the museum. First time ever in the history of the museum, in the history of the American wing at the museum, that Native American art is exhibited in the American wing. That's just beneath this gallery that you're looking at now. And so what they did in addition to that show was they re-evaluated all of the artworks that include depictions of Native Americans and invited Native American authors, scholars, artists, poets to re-author exhibition labels for the works depicting Native Americans. And so I'll read this one that was part of the Native Voices series. And this is, you can go to the museum and see this on view, describing this, this work here by James Van Wart. Created during America's centennial year and the era of Native American history characterized by forced removal and imposed relocation to reservations, Van Wart's Indian vase represents the complexity of American histories and our misunderstandings of them. This work has long been interpreted as an acknowledgement of the displacement of Native peoples. Here, an assumed dichotomy exists between the figures sitting along the rim. One is defiant while the other is defeated, though both await their inevitable demise. What happens if we disrupt the lingering 19th century notion that Native peoples are destined to disappear? How would this change our interpretation of these figures? Which is also to say that, we are still here, right? And what if we actually acknowledge or begin by acknowledging those that are still here? And so that's Jamie Powell, who's Osage, that offered that label. Other examples in the museum that I started to see later were examples like this. This is an incredible work by Wendy Redstar, who I love. I think she's also she's involved with Chautauqua. She's done programming with you guys, which is amazing. Love her work and the way that she is interrogating these visual histories, specifically through photography and the ways that Native peoples have been represented, and literally sort of like reclaiming them and reauthoring sort of the narratives that surround them. And so this is an image of Pretty Eagle from the 1880 Crow Peace Delegation, a piece that she did in 2014. And I really love her work because she is literally sort of intervening in this colonial history, reclaiming it and remixing it and sending it back to the viewers, right, with corrections. And I'm proud that the museum recently acquired a suite of her photos, including this work, and that they're stepping into sort of like a future that includes these kinds of corrections to their own colonial past. I mean, that I think is the sort of hopeful intention, I think, in some of this work now in the collection. You can especially see that exhibited currently on view. I feel like I'm telling representing the Met in this conversation, but these are exciting moments. This work by Kent Montman is one of the amazing works that's on view right now in the Great Hall. It's the first commission ever of paintings in the Great Hall. And the Kent Montman paintings, this one called Resurgence of the People, is another series where he makes these history paintings that recreate colonial histories in which Native Americans have been minimalized, marginalized, or excluded, and he makes them central to these narratives, right? And so this is an enormous painting, the size of Washington crossing the Delaware. You can see that it actually kind of mimics that composition. And this same photograph, this same painting was just acquired by the Met. They just announced it yesterday on Indigenous Peoples Day that they acquired this painting as part of their permanent collection, which is exciting, because one of my questions was, like, until that painting occupies the same kind of real estate in the permanent collection and actually is on view in conversation with these works, then there's still work to do at the institution, right? There's still work to do in terms of how we think about American history. So that was super encouraging. I'm going to show you a couple of other Montman paintings here. That's the other kind of companion painting, welcoming the newcomers. And so you see also this kind of alter ego character that's central in Kent's work, where he sort of reimagines himself in this alter ego as a character called Mischief Eagle Testicle, which is this kind of gender fluid alter ego that's time traveling and shape shifting as a supernatural being that sort of reverses the colonial gaze. He also does performance work that's kind of amazing. And these works are pretty spectacular. If you have an opportunity to go to the Met this year, you can't miss them because they're in the Great Hall. You can see them here for perspective. And this is the Met in their 150th year, really stepping in to this critique of their colonial past. So they say this on their own website. The new commission at the Met suggests the museum's willingness to self-reflect and consider its own collection with a critical eye. It represents an acknowledgement of the institution's complicity in perpetuating colonial discourses in art and beyond. And so I think that's a great quote, and I'm thrilled that this conversation is happening. There's still a tremendous amount of work to be done because the legacies of these histories, of these colonial histories, run deep, and they'll take more than a couple commissions to undo them. You're talking about the work of generations to come, but there's some good people at the institution doing this work. And this is another thing that happened this past year was the commission of the alcoves at the front of the museum. And so this is the work of Wangechi Mutu, and she made these amazing sculptures called "The New Ones Will Free Us." They're the first commissions ever to happen on the exterior facade. These alcoves were created about 100 years ago, and never filled with sculpture, always intended to have sculpture, but never filled until now. So amazing that Wangechi, a Kenyan-American artist, was commissioned to make these spectacular sculptures of these power figures of female forms that are almost like superhuman, supernatural, based on the caryatid. And the caryatids are these female forms that are usually sort of like performing a kind of labor in holding up the components of other sculptures. But here they really become liberated from those forms, related to both African history and African art history and European art history, and become these kind of otherworldly beings on the facade of the institution. The title, "The New Ones Will Free Us," always makes me think about the new ones being young ones, being the young people, being the younger generation, the next generation, younger than ourselves, that make me excited and that also sort of motivate a lot of the work that I do. So I'm going to take you along those lines, thinking of the new ones and the young ones. I want to take you to East Harlem, which is just up the street from the museum. This is my neighborhood. This is what it looks like in the summertime when there's no COVID. This is a photograph from the early 60s by Iram Maristani, who is an amazing photographer, still around here in East Harlem, born and raised, Puerto Rican photographer, who took some of the most special photographs of East Harlem of anybody that I've ever known. And these images of young people engaged just in sheer joy and play were a kind of counter image to the depictions of Puerto Ricans in this neighborhood in the 60s and 70s that were usually depicted in very negative ways. There were images, very stereotypical images of drugs and violence and crime that always led when talking about East Harlem. And Hiram, he also wanted to show the beauty and the humanity of the people in this neighborhood and the hope of the children. And I love these images. I mean, they're my favorite photographs of this neighborhood's history. This is a young Charlie Diaz flying kites on the rooftop in the early 60s. And they inspire me. And so, these traditions of flying kites on the rooftop for kids who were originally from the islands or whose parents came from the islands are trying to recreate these associations and connections to the sky on the roof, right? But the other place you would do this ordinarily would be at the beach. And so some people call the rooftops La Playa Negra, Tar Beach. La Brea is the tar on top of the roof, and that would be the place that you would fly from. And ironically, this was considered a safe space during these times in which the streets were dangerous. But the idea of escaping to the sky and imagining a kind of freedom with flying is something that's been inspirational in my work for a long time. And I've done a lot of projects about kites and kite flying. Originally did a project in Puerto Rico in 2002 with kites and portraiture and kite flying in the island of Vieques, which is part of Puerto Rico, and a part of Puerto Rico that was used as a bombing range for about 50 years. In 2002, I took a group of students to the island, Puerto Rican students from Brooklyn, to work with their peers in Vieques, and we flew these kites across the fences of the bombing range to protest the bombing that was happening in Vieques. So it was a sort of symbolic act of peaceful protest at that time. So this is Vieques, and you can see on the left-hand side is where munitions were stored. On the right-hand side with the pink is where the bombing happened. And this kind of highlighted section in the center is where people were forced to live in that cluster. In 1998, 99, a bomb missed its target and killed a civilian by the name of David Sanes. And that's the straw that broke the camel's back. And people occupied the bombing range and used their bodies as human shields to prevent the Navy from bombing. It was a Navy base there. This is an image of some of the bombing from air to land. Images of the munitions and the ordnance, exploded and unexploded, that have been collected over the years. And that's what this project was about. In 2002, 2003, the Navy left, 2003. And so it was a huge victory for the people. And this project was one of many, many, many projects. It was a very small sort of like gesture among a long legacy of activism on the island to get the Navy to leave. Since then, I've done this project in other communities, working afterwards with undocumented young people in the nation's capital. This is Marco Saavedra, an amazing young activist who's also featured in an incredible film called The Infiltrators by Alex Rivera. and Cristina Ibarra, and you guys should see that film and look for it. It's an amazing film about this young activist who infiltrates detention centers to help undocumented people detained. It's an amazing based on a true story. And so I got to work with these amazing activists in the nation's capital, and we flew these Dreamer kites behind the White House after Obama's second term, and trying to sort of like press on immigration reform issues in the nation's capital at that time. And a few images from that project. Sonia Winansaka here featured, who was a young student at Hunter College at the time, undocumented. Now she's the leader of Culture Strike, which is the nation's leading arts organization dealing with migration rights. And that image was on the cover of the Washington Post that weekend. So we got really lucky with the press. I mentioned that because the press in this case also became a tool, right, to try to leverage this conversation or expand it at least. And it didn't lead to like any immediate reform, but you know, it allowed for the young people involved to sort of tell their own stories and to speak for the project. And that's always something that's kind of important in this, is that I'm not the one telling these stories, that the project becomes sort of like a vehicle for people who are struggling in different ways with freedom and access to freedom to be able to tell their own stories about that experience. This is in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya. The largest public art project that I've done was this kite project called the Mani Kites in Nairobi. First in 2012 and later in 2014. And here working with young people in a collective called Wajukuu, which means grandchildren in Swahili. Amazing group of artists, educators, and activists that I got to partner with. And we flew these kites at the outskirts of the city eventually, bringing kids who lived in the industrial kind of centers of informal communities in Nairobi out to the countryside to work with others in more rural spaces. And what I love about this project every time that it happens is that it's, you know, essentially a project about young people seeing themselves and having an opportunity to see themselves flying. And so like the visual sort of symbolism is very poetic in this project. And it's a challenge. Like we have these workshops for a couple of weeks where we make the kites themselves. We talk about freedom and what that means in different communities in different parts of the world, and what the stakes are even for those conversations. Those conversations are led by local educators and activists. And at the culmination sort of this project, we end up flying the kites. That's sort of like the celebration at the end, if all the conditions are right. This is Frederick and his kite, who was a young shepherd in the hills, who came to fly with us and to work with us. And here you can see like Frederick's kite going up in the hills at the kind of outskirts of the city. So I mean, I haven't seen these images in a while, but I love this project so much because it's also very cathartic. It's very physical. Like the act of flying a kite is something that brings a kind of incredible joy to young people and adults alike, and also having this kind of relationship with the wind. These are large kites, so when you have really big kites and they have long tails, you really feel the elements and feel connected to the elements. And so that expression of joy and play is so important as a kind of form of resistance, I think, in the world today. And something I think a lot about in the work is like, how do we actually think about joy and play as a kind of resistance? And so in my other work, this is, you know, from kites to bikes, again, thinking about sort of histories of play. This is what some of my sculpture looks like. You know, these are vintage bicycles from the 1950s that relate to the traditions of Puerto Rican bike clubs in New York that sort of remade these bicycles from their childhood in association with the island. But it's also about kind of remaking these emblems of vintage Americana in the image of our own culture and history. And so this object is called the Double Phantom, and it's currently on view at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. It was recently acquired for their permanent collection. And it's about the tension between Puerto Rico and the US, one side representing the US, the other Puerto Rico, Politically, one side thinking of statehood with the US, the other side thinking of independence. And this sort of paradox of being sort of locked into one another in this colonial relationship. Despite that, the message in neon behind says pa'lante, which means to go forward in sort of colloquial Spanish. But it's a bike that cannot go forward without also going backwards, right, at the same time. So it really is a project that sums up our colonial paradox for me in many ways. This is a view of it in the Smithsonian, and I show this image because I'm very proud that it's in this collection, but I'm also proud of that because it's the only work on view that represents Puerto Rico. There are amazing works of Puerto Rican artists in the collection, thanks to this incredible curator, Carmen Ramos, who more than doubled the amount of works by Latino artists in the collection upon her arrival. But in the permanent collection on view, this is the only one that explicitly represents Puerto Rico. And I'm very proud of that, you know. It's not the only Puerto Rican artist on view, however. If you look in the background, there's a painting by Basquiat. And so I'm super proud that this work is in conversation with the work across the way. Basquiat, many of you might know, was also Puerto Rican and Haitian, Caribbean artist. And so that for me is also kind of exciting. Some details of this work. These are all vintage bikes that I hand restored, got re-chromed, repainted, made back into their original condition, painstakingly, pinstriped everything. I do all this work in my studio. And I love doing that work as a way of sort of like creating a relationship with this history itself. These are two 1952 Schwinn Phantoms that were conjoined with one another. That year, 1952, was the year of our Constitution in Puerto Rico. The year we were first able to elect our own governor. My great-grandfather was a part of the party, the Popular Party, that helped create that Constitution at the time. The color of the party was red. There's a lot of significance in the bike itself that's part of that history. And my family has a very political history in Puerto Rico in that sense. This work sort of gets to some of those issues. But this is where it comes from also. I'm sorry this image is so small. That's Julio Clavijo, the president of the Puerto Rico Schwinn Club in New York, who passed away recently. But we love him and we're grateful for his legacy in New York. And Bolo, who also passed away, with Eddie here, other members of the Puerto Rico Schwinn Club. And these guys are the folks, these guys, this is Richie, who's a member of one of the new clubs in sort of the new generation carrying on this legacy in Bushwick and Brooklyn. And this is part of the tradition that inspires my work, my sculpture. These are the guys that I ride with all the time also. And this is how I got to know them, was through this project. This is called Pimp My Piragua, was my first kind of bike sculpture. And it was turning a push cart for selling shaved ice, which we call piraguas in Puerto Rico, into this kind of fantasy ride. It's a bike with speakers, a huge sound system, flat screen, sort of like video monitors, DVD player, neon underbody lights, all kinds of bells and whistles, but still fully functional for selling piraguas. And so here you see me competing with the ice cream man on Knickerbocker Ave in Bushwick, selling piraguas, the shaved ice. This is like 10 years ago, 2009. And this is me last year, 2019. In the summer of 2019, riding again with the Puerto Rico Schwinn Club on the same street, Knickerbocker Ave, celebrating the Puerto Rican Day Parade in Brooklyn. And so, you know, I love that these traditions are still alive, and this is part of how we celebrate them. But I'm also, you know, interested in how this work as artwork was really made to return to the streets and to the people that inspired it. And I think about that with the work oftentimes. You know, in some ways this work kind of dies in a museum context. I mean, it's a beautiful show bike, but it comes to life in a community context. And so it was really made to return to those communities that inspired it. And I think about that with the work oftentimes that I'm doing. This is another bike I did later, and I wanted to show this to talk about how important history is. This is a bike called Puerto Rican Cotton Picker. 1971. That's the bike on a kind of bike stand and platform that's in the shape of the island of Puerto Rico. The bike itself, this 1971 Schwinn cotton picker, is not a name that I made up. That's a real name that Schwinn gave to this bike. In 1971, it was part of a series of bikes called crate bikes. And somebody thought it was a good idea to call the white bike the cotton picker. And it was politically incorrect even for its time, so it did not sell well, surprise. But it was discontinued. Today, however, it's incredibly rare and has become one of these collector's items in the bike collecting world. But for me, it was, one of these really problematic examples of how racism is so normalized within American popular culture that we can have a bike named the Cotton Picker exist without any problems, right? That it goes into production even. And so what was further problematic then was for me imagining this, like seeing one of these bikes on the Puerto Rican Schwinn Club, like with Puerto Rican flags on it. Then it was very confusing. Like, what is that about? Is it even being sort of like understood critically? And for me, that was a real problem to consider. And when I learned about this bike and saw this bike originally, so I started doing research on what's the relationship between cotton picking and Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans. And that led me to a history that I did not know about at the time, about a little known migration. One of our first migrations, in fact, to this country was in the 20s, where Puerto Ricans were recruited to pick cotton in Arizona. And in the background here, then I start to open up that history through the imagery of Felicita Mendez and the migration to Arizona. So Felicita Mendez, who was Felicita Gomez at the time, her family migrated from Juncos, Puerto Rico, a small town in Puerto Rico, to the cotton fields of Arizona in Pima County in the mid-20s. When her family, this is her family here, when they arrived, along with about 200 other Puerto Rican families, they were promised better jobs. They were promised higher pay. Puerto Ricans were very poor on the island at that time, those that were migrating for this work. And they were brought in to replace Mexican workers. And so in 1917, Puerto Ricans got citizenship through the Jones Act. And it didn't give us equal rights. It just made us citizens with an ability to travel without the same restrictions. But we were still exploited readily for labor. So Puerto Ricans being brought to Arizona was a way of bypassing immigration issues with this new labor pool. Excuse me. But they were exploited and forced to work and live in slave-like conditions, and they refused. So many of them protested those conditions and eventually got the attention of the Phoenix labor unions, who came to support them. And they formed some of the largest labor protests in Arizona state's history at the time. What happened? Well, their rights were improved, their living conditions were improved for a temporary period, and then they were basically canceled. Their labor contracts were canceled. Most of them moved to California and other places looking for work. And the Arizona cotton growers went back to importing Mexican labor that they could exploit even further. So Felicita ends up moving to California, where eventually she meets Gonzalo Mendez. The two of them are migrant farm workers in California, and in the 1940s, they had this unusual opportunity to go from being pickers to growers in Orange County in the early 40s. And so they have a farm, and they go to put their kids in the local school, and their kids are denied because the schools in Orange County are segregated. And Gonzalo and Felicita refuse to accept that. And they take the school district to court. Very, very famous case that you probably never heard of, Mendez versus Westminster, 1946, 1947. And it's a landmark civil rights case that becomes the precursor for Brown versus the Board of Education. And eventually they win this case in 47. And California became the first state to desegregate public schools in 1947. And that paved the way for Brown versus the Board of Education, which happens in 54, which leads to nationwide school desegregation. This is part of that history in Orange County. This could also be applied to Puerto Ricans. So Felicita was Puerto Rican, Gonzalo was Mexican, and they shared this Latino history. Eventually, this was commemorated as a stamp in 2007. Sylvia Mendez, the daughter of Felicita, received the Medal of Freedom from Obama. And so even though this legacy is still not well known nationwide, it has begun to be that are known and starting to be integrated into school curriculums. There are schools named after the Mendes family in California now. But part of this history that's also not well known is how they got access to that farm to begin with in the 40s. And this is another very difficult part of American history, is that in the early 40s, the Munamitsu family that owned the farm was incarcerated and forced to leave their farm after Executive Order 9066 was put into place by Roosevelt, forcing Japanese Americans into concentration camps. And 110,000 Japanese families were incarcerated and forced into concentration camps in different parts of the country, including the Munamitsu family. And the Munamitzus were among the only families really that didn't lose everything. One of the few that didn't lose everything because they shared a banker, this man named Mr. Monroe, with the Mendes family, who brokered a deal and created a lease agreement whereby this Latino family, the Mendes family, would lease the farm from the Munamitsus while they were incarcerated. So here you see Mr. Munamitsu and his daughters. He was separated from his daughters for 3 years. He was sent to a different camp and the rest of his family. These are images from their farm. And this is Mrs. Munamitsu with her 2 daughters. And in this is in 1942. In 1945, they were released from the camps. Every month, Gonzalo Mendes drove to Poston, Arizona to pay the rent to Mrs. Munamitsu. And his daughter would travel with him, Sylvia. And Sylvia eventually got to know Aki Munamitsu Nakauchi. Now her name is Aki Nakauchi. And Aki and Sylvia were friends from the time they were in 3rd grade. When the Munamitsu family moved back into their home, they were released from the concentration camps in Poston. The Mendes family was in the middle of fighting this segregation case against the Westminster School District. So the Munamitsus agreed to let the Mendes family continue to live there and to fight this case, and the 2 of them lived together and supported one another. This is an amazing story of solidarity of 2 families that were discriminated against horribly in that era. And they supported each other until the Mendes family could see through the next harvest and use the proceeds from that harvest to move to the next place, etc. And they continued to fight the lawsuit. They paid for the lawsuit themselves. They hired the lawyers, etc. And Aki and Sylvia formed a lifelong friendship. So last year, one of the great privileges of my life was that I got to host a conversation between Aki and Sylvia. I love this picture. Who are now in their 80s. And they have been lifelong friends. And it was such a privilege to talk to them together and to have them tell their own stories about this American history that not a lot of people know about. And about the ugliness of this history, but also about the hope of our present and future, right? But also about the difficulties of this history repeating itself. You know, we're talking about this at a time where kids have been in cages at the border, in more concentration camps, in detention centers, and history is in danger of repeating itself again and again. So that's part of why this conversation was so important. And you know, what was amazing about listening to both Aki and Sylvia is how they weren't bitter about this history somehow. And that blew me away, that they still saw a lot of hope and they were still encouraged by the potential of young people to transform this country. And they were also they also talked about how kind their parents were, like how their parents taught them these values of paying kindness forward and how supporting each other was so natural. So it's an amazing story of like how Constitution failed its own citizens historically. At this time when Japanese Americans were incarcerated, like 2/3 of those incarcerated were American citizens. When Latinos had to attend segregated schools, there were tens of thousands of Latinos fighting in World War II at the time. 9,000 that died in service. And so, back home, these were still the contradictions and the conflicts that existed in this country then. And we're still fighting against xenophobic policies in this country right now under this administration that could repeat some of those histories today. So all of that history and all of these connections I learned about through a bike. I would never have known it. And so this for me is also kind of like how the objects kind of teach me about histories lesser known, and create an opportunity for me as an artist and educator to then unpack those histories and teach them forward to people who also never learned about them. I felt cheated out of this. So it's a great privilege for me to be able to sort of talk about these things in my work, and especially to connect with people like Sylvia and Aki, who are just amazing, and I feel so lucky to know them. This work's currently on view in a show about social justice called Catalyst at Gracie Mansion, which is another weird context for this show that I won't go into now. But here you can see one of the best dedicated to the Mendes versus Westminster case. And it's also sort of about the sort of aesthetics of the time, or sort of resistance in the civil rights era, the kind of Viking vests that are also about the kind of activist groups that came afterwards. So thinking about Felicita Mendes and Sylvia Mendes, these legacies of activism and advocacy for social justice and racial justice, and moving forward into the civil rights era of the Young Lords and the Black Panthers. And so these buttons that cover the vest are about those histories. And more recently, I've done projects on these histories specifically in relation to my own neighborhood. I mentioned the Young Lords and the Black Panthers. So these are the Young Lords who were like Puerto Rican version of the Black Panthers, deeply inspired by Panthers' legacies. But they were founded in Chicago in 1968, and in New York formed in 1969 they formed the New York chapter. And these are again photographs from Hiram Maristani that I mentioned earlier, who is the photographer from East Harlem. That I've got a blank slide there. Here we go. Who shot these images of kids flying kites. So the same photographer shooting these beautiful images of children and of beauty and humanity in East Harlem in the early 60s. By the late 60s, is one of the founding members of the Young Lords, and is also an activist and an artist in this community at the same time, and the official photographer for the Young Lords. And so working with Hiram, we last summer did a public art project called Mapping Resistance to Young Lords in El Barrio, and we selected 10 photographs from his portfolio, turned them into billboards at the same locations where this history took place 50 years ago. Here you can see some details. This is Hiram and I, the artist himself, still a dear friend and neighbor to this day. And this is Hiram and I looking at one of the billboards after we just put it up. So on Lexington and 111 in East Harlem, and you can see in the background an image of the People's Church that would become a huge, important symbolic location in the Young Lords' history, because they occupied the church and they had a standoff there, reclaimed it for the community, renamed it the People's Church, and then they did free breakfast programs there, and they did health programs and screenings, and they used it as a cultural space, and it's a long part of this community's legacy. The street on 111 was renamed Young Lords Way, and we created a map of this neighborhood and of the public art project, where at 5 locations we spread 10 images out that you could sort of like walk this public art project in the neighborhood, and each one had a map and these narratives that accompanied them. And in addition to that, we did walking tours, over 100 walking tours all summer long. They were amazing. And so oral history was a big part of this, reactivating this with some of the original voices of the Young Lords, myself doing a lot of tours, writing tours, walking tours. But again, reclaiming this history that has, to some degree, become invisibilized in a neighborhood that's quickly gentrifying, and commemorating it while this history is still alive. This is absolutely a living history. The people that helped shape it are still very much among us. And so it was an incredible way to celebrate it. This is the first office space of the Young Lords, and a very young Juan Gonzalez in front of that office space. He was the minister of education at the time. He was the minister of different things. Juan Gonzalez you may recognize or know from Democracy Now!, very famous author, director of the School of Journalism at Rutgers. He's amazing. And so this went up in the same location where the office used to be, Madison 111 12th. In 1969. Denise Oliver, the first woman in the central leadership and central committee of the Young Lords. She's amazing. And really challenged the Young Lords to deal with machismo and to include women and women's issues as a central part of the platform. So that was a picture of her, a gorgeous portrait of her that was taken inside the office of the Young Lords. And so we work with local students, again, kind of teaching this history forward. And we even had moments like this that were incredibly special, where Denise herself came to see her portrait with Hiram, the same location that he took this portrait of her 50 years ago. And these were kind of amazing moments, very striking moments. She's still very much a fierce activist, inspiring voice in our community. And again, it sort of demonstrates how this legacy lives on. Denise was African American and also a member of the Black Panther Party, and so not all of the Young Lords were Puerto Rican. You didn't have to be Puerto Rican to be involved, but you had to be down for the cause of Puerto Rican liberation. And so Black and Puerto Rican liberation were deeply intertwined in this community's history. This was like the takeover of the X-ray truck, which was to bring the X-ray truck from a lesser used location in the city to East Harlem, which had the highest tuberculosis rates in the city. And they sort of appropriated the truck, you could say, and convinced the technicians to come with them and began administering services to our community. And these things led to actual changes, like the city took notice because the demands were much greater here, and it was effective. Like I said, the technicians went along with it, and they screened 3 times the number of people that they were normally screening, and it led to a regular truck in this neighborhood. Other images of the project here, the Balante newspaper, big part of that history. More walking tours in front of the march. Julio Rodan died mysteriously in a New York jail cell. He was a member of the Young Lords at the time. And a famous image here of the garbage offensive. The garbage offensive was the first action of the Young Lords. And when they organized in the neighborhood, the first thing they did was ask the community what they most wanted to see change in. And even though they were a revolutionary organization and wanted to free Puerto Rico and had really, ambitious goals, what people were really most concerned about initially was the quality of life in the neighborhood. It was filthy. The sanitation department wasn't picking up the garbage. And they didn't pick it up for sure at the same rates they were picking it up in the Lower and the Upper East Side, just nearby. So they protested by taking all the excess garbage that was left behind and making these barricades in the street. And so very famous action by the Young Lords. And it forced the city to deal with it. The police department, the fire department, sanitation, all had to come and deal with it. And then they mobilized the press at the same time. So when the sanitation department and the police and everybody come, the Young Lords spoke to the press and publicly shamed the city very effectively through the media. And this is way before social media exists. So all this is coordinated using the media as a tool 50 years ago. And it leads to better services. At least temporarily, it led to direct changes. So while we were doing this, these walking tours, we had a lot of moments like this that happened. And so this is Papo, he comes up during a walking tour, here's what we're talking about, and he points himself out, and he says, this is me when I was 15 years old. And again, a testimony here about these being living histories, right? Not of a past and a people that have been long gone and forgotten, but that are still very much here. And this happened all the time, that people from the neighborhood would begin to narrate these histories themselves. And it was very organic and it was really beautiful. It was a powerful part of the project. Yeah, I missed this project being up. A couple of these images are still up. This is one of my favorite images in the project. Doña Lola was not one of the members of the Young Lords. She was a community member, but she was at all the marches. And this is such an iconic photograph of her that's still up on our building here at PS 109, where I live. It's an artist live workspace in East Harlem. And I'm very proud that this has remained on view. And it's still, a great source of pride for our neighborhood today. So the other aspect of this project that we did that I want to sort of like show here as another part of the work is about community action. So health, food, and healing health, food, education, and housing were really the platform of the Young Lords. We focused on health, food, and healing as public programs. And in commemoration of that history of the free breakfast programs and of the acupuncture clinics that they actually were the first people to introduce acupuncture, detox acupuncture, as a holistic remedy to deal with addiction in the South Bronx. Young Lords and Black Panthers introduced acupuncture to city hospitals in New York. Now all city hospitals, every municipal hospital has detox acupuncture as an available remedy, as available practice because of this history. So we hosted free breakfast programs for the community to commemorate this, this legacy. And these are a few images of some of those programs. Here in the same building that I live in at PS 109, we have a gallery, kind of public space. And we got all the food from the amazing partners at Harlem Grown. This is Ada, who's one of the farmers at Harlem Grown. And that's a farm that's in a public housing project, the Wagner Houses up on 122nd Street here in East Harlem, just blocks away. And so we were thinking about how to model a breakfast program or a food program, thinking sustainably, organically, et cetera. And we hosted the acupuncture clinics, which were amazing. So we invited, this is Jose, one of our neighbors, still around. He's in his 90s, 92 years old, if you can believe it, having his first acupuncture treatment here. So auricular therapy on the ears is where they focused their therapies. And here you see former young Lord Walter Bosque with Luis Bonet, who is a young acupuncturist and activist from the island, offering healing to one another, two generations. Young lords and the next generation of activists working on health and healing with one another. Really, really powerful experience. And it was so popular that we were asked to bring it back. So we started to host monthly acupuncture workshops at the space. And so we had former young lords that started these programs, you know, in the early 70s, administering the healing to a new generation of people in East Harlem. And sometimes also receiving that healing, which was amazing. Here, you see an image of Hiram Maristani, the photographer that I mentioned, receiving his first acupuncture treatment, in fact. Even though he was a young lord, he was always the photographer and wasn't in the acupuncture clinics. That was a detox space, but this is also about sort of health and wellness today. So a really beautiful part of that project. While we were doing this project in East Harlem, this is in 2019, summer before this past summer, this is what was happening in Puerto Rico. So some of you may remember that the island revolted, and these uprisings were incredible because there were thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people manifesting to demand the resignation of the governor. So Ricky Rosselló and Ricky Renuncia, you might remember these hashtags. This is a huge call of the Puerto Rican people to get the governor to resign because he had so offended people after Hurricane Maria. And after his insults, and these chats were made public against so many different people affected by the hurricanes. So the mismanagement of the crisis after the hurricane, the fiscal crisis because of the debt crisis on the island, all became reasons for the uprising. And in the biggest uprisings, you had upwards of 500,000 people manifesting across political lines, demanding the resignation of the governor. And so that's almost 20% of the population. There's 3.5 million people in Puerto Rico. So, I mean, that's an incredibly high number of people protesting. And if we had anything near that in New York City or anywhere in the United States, it would be revolutionary. So this is significant, and it worked. The governor resigned. And so, what we got afterwards were kind of the remnants of that administration that are equally problematic. But it was a people's movement, a people-powered movement that rose up to demand change. Hugely inspiring and especially important for me, thinking about the significance of the uprisings in this country, and demands for police reform and the end of racial violence in this country have been huge. And I think about the connections between these movements to decolonize and the movement for racial justice as being absolutely interconnected. So you'll see the Puerto Rican flag in black and white. This is the normal colors, the original colors, I should say, the light blue in the flag, especially in the triangle. And after the debt crisis, and the PROMESA Act is one of the responses to the debt crisis. In 2016, Congress passed the PROMESA bill, which was supposed to be a relief bill for Puerto Rico, and it ended up just being an austerity program that was governed by US appointed financial officials that now have power over local officials. So for the first time in 50 years, a U.S. appointed body had full control over the Puerto Rican government, over the Puerto Rican economy. And when that happened, people began to paint the flag black and white as a symbol of mourning and protest. And activists showed up to protest the fiscal board, also known as La Junta, every time that they met on the island. And this is significant because this is people saying that we deserve to be self-determined and in control of our own destiny and of our island's fate. And so they're basically liquidating all of the public resources of the island in order to pay back a debt that's owed to U.S. bondholders, hedge fund groups. It's a very complicated mess that is going to make poor people even poorer for many, many generations to come. But these DIY kinds of shields and protests continued throughout the island. This is at May Day a couple years back. And so I think a lot about these histories also of protests that have been around for a couple of years now, and much longer than that. But one of the impacts in Puerto Rico has been in school closures. And hundreds and hundreds of schools have closed in response to the debt crisis. A couple hundred in the last couple of years alone, but over 700 schools have closed within the last decade. And these are public schools that are not going to reopen, and the impact long-term on the future of our children's education is extreme. One of the things I started to notice that was kind of an effect of this were these school buses, these abandoned school buses and kind of school bus graveyards on the island. And I was thinking about those as a kind of symbolic kind of residue, but also as an opportunity to kind of repurpose this material and turn it into kind of some form of resistance, right? Some form of material that could be also about resistance. So we started to strip down these abandoned school buses, took off the sheet metal, and started to turn them into protest shields. So imagining again the protests and those who were protecting the rights of our children's education and the future of our children's education, using these decommissioned school buses as a kind of armor, right, to protect themselves against the police who are protecting the financial board, which is a US imposed, very colonial board that's closing schools. And so this is what it started to look like, you know, some of the shields themselves. At the Met, where I spent a lot of time, I'm looking at a lot of the arms and armors in the galleries there. And, you know, that was part of the inspiration for this work as well. But thinking again about people-powered movements and how the DIY shields of the protesters also come into play here for this cause. So these are just a few in-process images of this work. This is very recent work, by the way. I did this summer, and this summer felt like the right time to complete this work. It's now on view in Connecticut at an art space New Haven in an exhibition that's about the history of the Black Panther Party in New Haven, Connecticut. It's the 50th anniversary of the May Day trials in New Haven, and so this is currently on view there for another couple weeks maybe. And this is sort of a front and back view here of that work. This is very recent work. But again, I mean, this is really also influenced by all of the uprisings, the solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and with the calls for racial justice that are not just in this country, but throughout the world, including Puerto Rico. So lastly, I thought I would show this image, which I also haven't looked at. It's a recent project. It's actually on view in Holland right now, of all places, in a show about the Caribbean that's called the visual, oh my gosh, it has a complex title that it's just escaping right now. The Visual Life of Social Affliction is what the show is called. And I thought it was a good place to kind of end because what this is a sculpture of, it's called Colonial Weight. And it's a sculpture of two cannonballs from the Spanish colonial area in Puerto Rico. They're antiques, artifacts that are 200 or 300 years old, probably closer to 300 years old. And here they form these barbells. And, you know, I was thinking about how do we transform sort of the objects that represent war and warfare and violence and colonialism into a kind of tool that can also make us stronger, right? How do we actually transform that history and transform those objects and create a kind of sort of symbolic object that that envisions that kind of transformation, right? So that's where this work is at right now, and I'm going to leave it there. And I thank you for your time and for tuning in tonight. And I hope that we have some time maybe for some questions here. Folks still here? I'm looking here to see if folks are on.
Miguel,
Yeah,
I'm
hey.
hopping real quick because I'm Chip, by the way. No one ever gets to see me during these things. So I hopped in real quick. We're just waiting for Sharon to come into the session.
Did I didn't follow the chat during this thing? Did any of this get recorded, or did it crash through again, or?
So we recorded it locally through someone's machine.
Okay.
So we were able to work something out, or at least through IT. I guess I
Okay.
communicated with them. So again, we apologize to everyone at the beginning for that slight delay in the process, but I think we got something worked out. And so what I'm going to do is go ahead and put us over into the Q&A mode. You guys can see the directions here on the screen. Essentially, if you look over your name under the participants tab on your right-hand side, you can see a little camera icon. If you click on that, you'll be prompted to join the Q&A session, and you can come in and speak directly with us if you like, if you have any questions.
I'm here.
Sharon's here.
I don't know what happened. We're having some major technical problems tonight. This is crazy, but I'm happy that Chip explained this because he can explain it a lot better than myself.
I can't.
So,
well, I'll pop out momentarily and let you guys audit this session, okay? But it's nice to see everybody.
Nice to see you, Chip. Thanks for managing everything on the back end. And Miguel, my God, it was fascinating. I mean, how awesome was that? I think that we can have, if we have a few minutes left for some questions from people. And I think, let's see, I'm looking here and I haven't seen any questions yet, but surely people will be popping up to ask a question or two before we let you go, because you were so kind to answer a lot of questions before we started recording. And I'm sorry for all the technical problems.
No problem.
But we have somebody here, is Makiba Rainey, who is actually one of our participants this past summer. And she says, "Hola, Miguel, thank you so much for your words. Your investigative research is next level, exclamation point. I feel like you're just completely aligned with your purpose, how everything comes together. What are some of the resources you use for your research?" Great question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, right now, it's involved a lot of research in the archives at the institution, for example, which, by the way, you don't have to be in this residency to request access to the archives necessarily if you're a researcher or even potentially an artist that wants to do research at some of these institutions. The drawing and prints galleries at the Met, for example, you could potentially request access to and an appointment. Right now during COVID, I think things are probably not open, but ordinarily, that's the kind of stuff that I've been learning how to do with institutions. On my own, I would say, like, you know, I grew up like really hungry for books that were about the histories that were not in my regular books, right? I grew up being frustrated with art history in art schools because almost none of the artists that I most admired, and even that I knew as influences, they were never featured. And so it took me a while to find alternative texts. I went to the bookshop of Museo del Barrio to find a lot of stuff on Puerto Rican art and history. And it was a gold mine for me in that regard, because they had books from the island and they have books from here. I speak Spanish, but I didn't grow up speaking Spanish academically. And so was always looking for books in English, and grew up in this kind of space in between both cultures and both languages. So now there's like a lot of us who have that experience, you know, and there's a huge demand for, I think, for not just texts that exist in different languages, but that also address these different cultural histories and legacies. And but in school, like it started with like A People's History of the United States and like, you know, Howard Zinn and, you know, Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Lowen. I still like refer to those books a lot, you know, which are considered kind of revisionist histories, you know, textbooks, but it's like they're books that tell larger truths that have been repressed or erased, you know, from mainstream narratives. And I think that's important right now because what we see happening, not just under this administration, but even beforehand, is that the way that history books and public schools and curriculums are being sort of streamlined and nationalized by corporations risks a kind of limitation of information that's going to continue. So, you know, I also got lucky with a couple of teachers, you know, that pointed me in other directions. So, yeah, but I got to say, like doing the work independently while we can is really important too.
I love it. It's very inspiring. So we have time for just one more question if anybody has one. And if they don't, I have a question for you that I was asking beforehand. So maybe I'll ask it really quickly while we're waiting, if that's all right with you. So it would be actually maybe 1.5 questions. I'll say a half question. It's a big one. So can you tell me how were your parents always supportive of being an artist and how you came to be an artist? You know, what was it that created this awesome trigger for you to do this? And usually triggers are not great and they're aligned with trauma, but in the opposite way, something that inspired you to be where you are today.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky. My mom, you know, raised my brother and I, and single mom, you know, she was amazing and is amazing. And she always encouraged me in my artwork, always, like, you know, from the time I was little. So that was automatic, and I'm lucky in that regard. But I think like as a teenager is where I started to realize that I could merge these things, these passions for like social justice and activism could also relate to art as a tool or as a vehicle. And you know, I did mural painting and I did all kinds of other things, you know, in terms of early public art projects as a way to explore that, sort of like how to create public messaging. And it continued from there, but it was you know, like I said, as long as I can remember in my adult life, I've been teaching and also involved in activist circles. But I came from also a political family, like in Puerto Rico, on my dad's side, very political family. And, you know, my great grandfather signed the Constitution of Puerto Rico in '52 and was very—
Oh my God.
Yeah, he was a part of that early history in the formation of what became the Commonwealth Party and the,
wow,
which is the Popular Democratic Party, at a time where that was imagined, I think, to them as a kind of progressive step in this kind of really neo-colonial partnership with the U.S. But it really didn't become that at all. And we continue to be a colony. We are still a colony today. And so his sons, my uncles, became much more radical in their politics and very pro-independent in their politics. And so we had both of those influences. And one of my uncles was an artist. And so I grew up also understanding a history of resistance and the importance of self-determination and there's, you know, the way that they got involved. So, but it's, you know, all of what we do is political in this world, especially now. And so, and the stakes are high. So like, even if you don't think of yourselves as a political artist, like, you know, the stakes have never been higher for my generation to get involved and to think about how your work is also a platform, you know, whatever kind of work you do, you know, how our voices are a platform, you know, but silence is just cannot be an option. That's how we end up with what we had the last 4 years.
Yeah, what you said before the recording, you said racism is on the ballot, and there's no question about it. I think that was so well said from you, and everything you said tonight has been incredible. So we've run out of time, and I'm hoping that next year we can have you come if we have a physical season at some point. And I really want you to visit and extend this conversation in person. And I just can't thank you enough for joining us again. I could have you every single month. I mean, every month, continue this, because I have a feeling you have a lot more that you can share. So thank you again so much for being with us tonight. It's just been extraordinary, and thanks to everyone who was able to view this. And I'm just so grateful. And Chip, could you put up the next slide? I mean, Miguel, the next person who's actually coming right after you is Joe Stallman. He's the director of the Seneca Nations, Seneca Iroquois National Museum, which is outside of Chautauqua, actually. And we've just come to have a partnership with them when I started my position as artistic director. And we're now really trying to bring their artists from their nation into Chautauqua and have exchange with them. And it's been extraordinary getting to know him. He's also really inspiring. So I'm hoping that I'll share that recording when it happens, unless you can make it. It'll be next month on November 10th, a week after the election. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, exactly. When the world is, whatever the world becomes at that time.
Whatever the world becomes, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everybody for being here on the open porch. And I'm sorry again for the technical difficulties, but those who are seeing the recording, hope you enjoyed it as well. And we look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks again. Thanks everybody.
Thank you guys.
Good night. Thank you.